Hello, everybody. My name is Happy, and I'd like to welcome you all to my History Reaction channel. Today, we're going to be continuing with the Napoleonic Wars and the retreat from Moscow in 1812 by Epic History. As always, I will include a link to the original video in the description down below. If you like what you see here, please consider heading over to Epic History. Show them some love and support for the hard work they very obviously put into this series. All right, with that said, last time we left off, Napoleon had triumphantly marched into Moscow, only to find it mostly abandoned and fires started. As I mentioned at the end of that last video, there are a lot of controversies over who started those fires. It was probably a mix of things, and hopefully we'll get into that in this video. Could have been a mixture of drunken French soldiers, retreating Russians, or even specific individuals. In fact, I think there is evidence supporting the idea that there were some initial accidental fires that were compounded by deliberate arson a little bit later. So this will be a fun video in that we're going to see Napoleon at his weakest point. I mean, this is going to get bad for him here. We're going to begin the retreat, and the retreat is devastating. There's a famous chart showing visually how the Grand Armée evolves from the time that it leaves or enters Russia, gets to Moscow, and then returns. We'll take a look at that after this video, assuming Epic History doesn't cover it, because I think it is a good visual aid help us see just how devastating this whole campaign really was. It's called the Minard chart, and it is, many historians consider it one of the best history-related charts ever made. It's just brilliant. But we'll take a look at that at the end of this video if they don't cover it here. Peace lies in Moscow. Oh, our sweet, innocent, naive Napoleon. Napoleon, 8th of September, 1812. You got to remember, this time, Moscow's not the capital any longer. St. Petersburg is. The Tsar Alexander's up in Petersburg. So, but yes, it's still an important city. It's a very strategic city. It makes sense that Napoleon would have gone for it. But in terms of forcing a surrender, as long as the Tsar's free and the capital's still intact, there's still a good point of resistance. There's a point of leadership. So it's not the victory that he really expected it to be, and probably never would have been. Poland had captured Moscow for a significant period of time, installed their own Tsar there, and still the Russians fought back. Russia is not gonna call it quits just because you got a major city. That's just not historically how they operated.
Russia, 1812. Napoleon invades his former ally with the largest army Europe has ever seen. But for the French Emperor, the decisive blow remains frustratingly beyond reach. Russia's resilience is unlike anything he's ever encountered. And as winter closes in, his army begins the most infamous retreat in history.
Oh yeah. There's no overstating how brutal this was.
The 15th of September, 1812. 83 days after invading Russia, a week after his costly victory at Berezina, Napoleon entered Moscow. He expected to be greeted by dignitaries, formally offering the city's surrender. Instead, he discovered that 90% of Moscow's inhabitants had fled.
That's a pretty serious generalization there. Exact numbers of how many people fled, how many remained, I don't think are known. but it was definitely a significant portion. So 90%, I would say, is directionally correct. In other words, the right idea. But don't take that as a factual number. That's more just to give you an idea of just how abandoned it really was. There had been hundreds of thousands in the city before they arrived, and now we're just a fraction of that remain.
A fire had started the previous night and was blamed on drunken soldiers.
Yep.
But over the next 48 hours, fires continued to break out across Moscow until most of the city was ablaze.
Yeah. One thing you got to remember is at this particular time, most of Moscow was wooden. And this wouldn't be any different than many other cities at this time. The exception would be the Kremlin. The Kremlin actually comes from the Russian word Kreml, which just means fortress. And many of the older cities built up around Kremls. That would be your center of government and religion, and then the wooden buildings would construct around that. So the Kremlin survives, but pretty much the rest of the city is wooden, and it goes up pretty quick. Significant damage. About 2/3 of the city was destroyed, including most of their historical document up to that point, which is why looking at Russian history prior to the 1820s really is extremely difficult, because a lot of the records were lost in these fires. Not all of them, but a significant portion.
Count Fyodor Rostopchin, the city's governor, had ordered that Moscow be destroyed rather than allowed to fall into enemy hands.
Yeah.
And now fires were being started deliberately by Russian criminals, freed from jail and acting on police orders. French soldiers rounded up and shot any they could catch.
Yeah, and I think that's why there's so much controversy over who started the fires. Sorry, I just had Billy Joel's song, "We Didn't Start the Fires," blare in my head when I said that. Anyway, it's because it probably wasn't a single fire event. It may very well have started initially with drunken soldiers, probably French soldiers. But we do know that an order was given to destroy the city. It wouldn't shock me at all to find out that they did release criminals and say, "Have fun, boys. Here's a torch for you." But there's also not a lot of corroborating evidence for all of this. But it is very believable, and it is in character. So that's probably why there's some controversy. We just don't know 100% for sure, other than we do know that it did become deliberate, and this is probably what happened to make it deliberate.
But the inferno was impossible to contain.
Oh yeah, gets out of control that bad.
In 4 days, 2/3 of Moscow was destroyed.
Yep.
With the fires finally under control, Napoleon's soldiers turned their attention to systematically looting the ruined city. While from his new quarters in the Kremlin, Napoleon sent a letter to Emperor Alexander in St. Petersburg, inviting him to make peace and end the war. He received no reply.
Yep, it got
Napoleon
ghosted.
waited, confident that Alexander...
And that was deliberate by Alexander, by the way. He didn't reply deliberately, because if he'd replied, then Napoleon would have been able to make an immediate decision, right? Yes, I surrender. Okay, that's one outcome. Or we're going to fight. Well, that tells Napoleon I need to do something about that. By ghosting him, it creates uncertainty, it creates delay, and that's what this is all about. This is about delaying Napoleon in Moscow, giving the Russian forces time to regroup, forces from further east that are coming in to arrive, and for winter to get closer. It was a calculated move by Alexander to not reply at all. keep him waiting, keep him guessing.
Would eventually negotiate. But as the days passed, he grew increasingly uneasy.
As he should.
Cossack raids were disrupting his vital communications with Paris,
Right.
as well as the arrival of supplies. While the steady attrition of French forces and Russian reinforcements meant Napoleon was outnumbered for the first time in the campaign.
And it's been hard so
Rumours
far.
also reached him that his reluctant allies, Prussia and Austria, were in secret talks with his enemies.
Sixth coalition forming right about now. I mentioned this at the end of the last video. In 1812, so much is changing because there's just so much going on. But yeah, between what's happening over in Spain with the Spanish and the Portuguese resisting constantly, tying up hundreds of thousands of French troops, combined with Wellington marching through, and that combined with all these men that Napoleon losing in Russia, you know all these other areas that he conquered are looking at this and saying, hey, he's tied up. He's in trouble. He's struggling. His army is literally split in two now. He's got whatever he got left over in Russia, plus what he got tied down in Spain. This area, I mean, who's he got over here now? Not much, right? So, yeah, of course they're plotting behind his back. Why wouldn't they be?
Napoleon had proposed that the army winter in Moscow, but that now looked too dangerous.
Oh, yeah.
Reluctantly, he accepted that the army would have to move back to Smolensk to find safe winter quarters.
That's not going to work. The whole way this fighting has been going, the Russians have been practicing slash and burn. They've been cutting down and destroying all the farmland and support structures as they retreated in front of Napoleon, and that includes both deliberate retreats to draw him in further, as well as retreats from battles like Smolensk or Berezina. And even Moscow itself is on fire. The warehouses are burned down. You can bet they probably burned the farm fields around Moscow, too. Getting supplies in here is getting harder and harder. And wintering at Smolensk is going to be hard because it was devastated. It was destroyed. And everything around it is not going to be sustainable for keeping a large number of soldiers. Too much of it has been destroyed because of this war.
Napoleon knew how severe Russian winters could be, but continued to put off his departure, reassured by fine October weather, and hoping that at the last minute there might be a message from Alexander offering peace.
Which is not going to happen.
It never came. On the 13th of October, the first light snow fell. 5 days later, Kutuzov launched a surprise attack on Murat's advance guard at Vinkovo and defeated it. Napoleon, stung into action, gave the order for the army to leave Moscow the next day.
Now is the moment my campaign begins. Emperor Alexander of Russia, St. Petersburg, October 1812. This is what he was waiting for.
100,000 men of the Grand Armée left Moscow in a column 10 miles long.
One thing I want to mention is a lot of these dates, there's some discrepancies on the dates. A day earlier, a day later for a lot of these battles and movements and events. Part of that's just contradicting sources, and part of that has to do with confusions over the dating systems. Remember that Russia is still on the Julian calendar, whereas the French and most of the rest of the world are on the Gregorian. So their dates don't align to when you're looking at these references. First of all, you need to know what dating system you're looking at. And second, we need to understand a lot of these Napoleonic campaigns and so on that take place in Russia. You'll often find references that are plus or minus a day from each other. So one reference may say the 19th, the next may say the 18th. One day may say the 14th, the next reference will say the 15th. That seems to be really common, and I'm not sure exactly what causes all of that, but it seems to happen a lot with Napoleon's Napoleonic events in Russia during this campaign.
With an estimated 40,000 carriages and carts. There were women and children too, army wives and the vivandières, the women who cooked for the soldiers, as well as some civilians. Every wagon and pack was stuffed with as much food and loot as possible.
Yep.
As he set off,
they packed a lot of loot. That is not a good thing to do, not in this situation. That's going to bite them in the butt.
Sergeant Bourgogne of the Imperial Guard made an inventory of his pack. It contained several pounds of sugar, some rice, some biscuit, half a bottle of liqueur, a woman's Chinese silk dress embroidered in gold and silver, several gold and silver ornaments, amongst them a piece of the cross of Ivan the Great. Besides these, I had my uniform, a woman's large riding cloak, 2 silver pictures in relief, 12 inches long and 8 high, all in the finest workmanship. Also several lockets, and a Russian prince's spittoon set with precious stones. I wore over my shirt a yellow silk waistcoat, which I had made myself out of a woman's skirt. Over that, a large cape lined with ermine, and a large pouch hung at my side by a silver cord. This was full of various things, amongst them a crucifix in gold and silver, and a little Chinese porcelain vase. Then there were my firearms, powder flask, and 60 cartridges in the box. This heavily encumbered army did not yet realize it was in a race against time.
Oh yeah.
The Russians were beginning to move against the flanks of Napoleon's 550-mile-deep salient. That very day, Wittgenstein's army was driving back Marshal Saint-Cyr's outnumbered force at Polotsk and drawing Victor's 9th Corps west to support them. In the south, Admiral Chichagov's advance had Schwarzenberg's Austrian Corps falling back to cover Warsaw. The corridor was closing. And then there was the weather. Though Napoleon was confident his army could reach winter quarters in Smolensk in 20 days, well before the more extreme temperatures were due to hit.
Yeah, and he did actually want to head south first, because for one thing, like I said, the terrain that he already covered was largely destroyed and not good for supporting an army on the move with additional supplies if you need to forage. Whereas going south, you're getting into territories you haven't already cleaned out. So he had originally planned on heading further south and then swooping over to the west. And he does do that to some degree throughout these movements. But he just isn't really able to do it to the degree that he had intended. Every time he tried to go further south, he kept getting pushed back by Russian forces.
Napoleon planned to withdraw via Kaluga, through unspoilt country where the army could forage for supplies.
Exactly, yes.
But Kutuzov sent General Dokhturov's 6th Corps to block the road at Maloyaroslavets.
Oh boy, yeah, that's a big one.
In fierce fighting, Italian troops of Eugene's 4th Corps drove the Russians out of the town. It was a hard-won victory, reminiscent of the fighting at Borodino. Kutuzov now stood between Napoleon and Kaluga.
Yeah, this is where Napoleon, according to some sources, almost gets captured.
Napoleon now took the unusual step of conferring with his marshals. And after discussing various options, he decided that rather than seek another major battle, they would retreat the way they'd come, along the Smolensk road. Napoleon had hoped to avoid this route, as it meant marching back through country already stripped bare of supplies. The day after the fighting at Maloyaroslavets, Napoleon was nearly captured by a group of Cossacks, and saved only by General Rapp's charge at the head of his escort.
Now, this one it almost certainly happened, but evidence for this is kind of sparse. It turns up in writings more than a decade after the Napoleonic, after 1812. I believe, in fact, Raps is the first one to report it, the guy who claimed to have come in and saved Napoleon. But official dispatches, as far as I know anyway, and I could be wrong about this, but as far as I know, there were no official dispatches or records kept by Napoleon or his immediate entourage regarding this event. We hear about it, like I said, over a decade later in memoirs from some of the soldiers under Napoleon, including some of his commanders. So this we kind of have to take a little bit with a grain of salt. It probably happened, but like I said, the earliest source that I'm aware of comes from Rapp himself, talking about how he heroically saved Napoleon. And when you have something like that, you kind of have to squint at it a little, if you know what I mean. But we do have corroborating versions as well from a couple of other sources. So something like that probably did happen. It certainly is within the realms of plausibility. This is where he supposedly starts carrying around a pouch of poison around his neck. There's a better evidence for 1814, when he again almost gets captured by Cossacks. That one's better documented.
After this close shave, Napoleon had a phial of poison made up, which he carried around his neck in case of capture.
Those who were too weak to carry their weapons or knapsacks threw them away, and all looked like a crowd of gypsies. Private Jacob Walter, 7th Württemberg Regiment.
Napoleon's army set off on its new course, shadowed at a respectful distance by Kutuzov's army to the south. They passed the old battlefield of Borodino, a grisly, unnerving sight where crows pecked at half-buried corpses. Relentless marching quickly began to tire out men and horses.
That couldn't have been good for morale to walk through that battlefield again and still see corpses out there. And he just made a really good point. When we talk about casualties in Napoleon's army during this retreat, let's not forget to count the horses, because a lot of these horses are going to be dying. And, of course, not only are they carrying soldiers, but they're crucial to the supply chain and communications. As these horses are dying off, it gets harder and harder for Napoleon to send out scouts, to send out messengers, and to carry or pull artillery as well as supply wagons. And that's why when they left Moscow and they bring all this loot with them, it was such a horrible idea. In hindsight, of course, hindsight's 2020, right? But I feel like he probably should have known. I don't know if he could have convinced his men to leave it behind. That's a different issue. I feel like he should have realized that winter's coming. We're going to have a really hard time getting out of here. Of course, he was planning on wintering at Smolensk, so that might have played into that. But this is, when you're in a retreat like this and you're racing time, you got enemies consolidating around you, and now they actually outnumber you. Might be a time to tell you guys, leave behind the loot, guys. Again, hindsight 2020, but when you look at this big picture, I'm not sure why you wouldn't think along those lines, but maybe it's just me, and again, hindsight. Or maybe it's just because I play a lot of video games, I'm a hoarder, and I have more than a few deaths because I picked up way too much stuff than I can actually carry, get hindered, and get wiped out. So it's a lesson I've learned the hard way.
A few days later, the temperature fell below freezing, the army's overworked, starving horses died en masse.
Yeah.
Discipline began to break down, as some drivers simply dumped the sick and wounded by the roadside to try to ensure their own survival. As the French column became increasingly strung out, General Miloradovich, commanding Kutuzov's advance guard, fell on Davout's rearguard outside Vyazma. For a few hours, Davout's first corps was cut off, until Eugène and Ney came to his rescue. The battle ended with street fighting in Vyazma, as the French hastily evacuated the burning town. For the soldiers of the Grand Armée, so unaccustomed to retreats and routs, Vyazma was an alarming, demoralizing blow.
Makes sense. The road was strewed with the dead. Our suffering exceeded imagination. General Rapp, Napoleon's aide-de-camp.
On the 4th of November, it began to snow heavily. The next night, temperatures plummeted to -20 degrees centigrade.
Crazy cold.
Few men or women had proper winter clothing or access to shelter.
One thing I'll add on the temperatures is that different sources give slightly different numbers on that as well. And that's to be not surprising. Some of them are just guessing. Some of them are using different types of measurements, so that's not really surprising. But when he talks about some of these temperatures, realize that that depends on the source that you're looking at. There's a lot of contradictory information on some of these temperatures. But the general idea is absolutely correct. It would have been around that cold.
Many froze to death overnight. The next morning, wagons and guns were abandoned.
Yep.
Many soldiers sought to save themselves, ignoring officers, stealing horses and food, and leaving the column to scour the countryside for supplies.
Yep. Hypothermia is going to be big, frostbite, but also because they're limited on supplies, they're going to be getting poor nutrition. That's going to allow disease to set in. You're also going to be looking at things like some of the effects of hunger, including an obsession with food, which is going to lead to what they just talked about here, men leaving the column to go out and scavenge for food on their own. And then behavior, I cannot say this word today. I've mentioned this in previous videos when we're talking about famine and things like that. There have been studies showing that our behavior actually changes when we get our caloric intake falls below a certain level for a significant period of time, just a week or two at a time. Is all it really takes, and you start having people becoming fixated with food. You start having people becoming apathetic. They just don't care about anything else anymore other than food, including their friends, their family, their country, anything like that. So you're going to start seeing some of that taking place here. You'll see fantasizing about food start happening. These kind of things are pretty common, and there have been studies that show this is a real psychological effect. So yeah, it's going to get worse and worse as they push.
Many of these foragers were found by the Cossacks.
Yeah.
Some cut down or lanced, others robbed of every possession and left to freeze. In a few cases, they were handed over to peasants, eager for retribution against the foreign invaders who had plundered all they owned.
That's bad.
As the army struggled on towards Smolensk through blizzards, Napoleon ordered Eugène's 4th Corps to strike out for Vitebsk, where there were large French supply depots. But Vitebsk had already fallen to the Russians.
Oops.
4th Corps was too weak to fight its way through and rejoined the army, minus its artillery and most of its baggage. A colonel who saw 4th Corps at this stage described men without shoes, almost without clothes, exhausted and famished, sitting on their packs, sleeping on their knees, and only rousing themselves out of this stupor to grill slices of horse meat or melt bits of ice.
Yep.
Just 3 weeks after leaving Moscow, a third of the army was dead or captured. About half the rest formed a growing army of stragglers, men without units, prepared to fight only to survive. Napoleon reached Smolensk on the 9th of November. The first troops into town ransacked the supply depots, leaving nothing for those who followed, including Ney's rearguard, which arrived 6 days later. Napoleon had hoped to make Smolensk his winter base, but the state of the army and lack of supplies meant the retreat had to continue. But the 5 days he spent there gave Kutuzov time to circle ahead and prepare an ambush. When the French retreat resumed, he struck 30 miles west of Smolensk at Krasny. In 3 days of desperate fighting through knee-deep snow, Napoleon used his Imperial Guard to hold open the road, as Eugène and Davout's corps fought their way through the ambush with heavy losses. 2 regiments of the Young Guard were ordered to make a sacrificial counterattack to keep the Russians at bay, and were virtually annihilated. Kutuzov held back many of his troops and was blamed for not trying to destroy Napoleon's army when he had the chance. It's possible he was concerned at the number of raw conscripts in his own army, also suffering terribly in the freezing conditions.
All the Cossacks and the Russians in the world shall not prevent me from rejoining the army. Marshal Ney, 17th of November at Smolensk. Go Ney!
Not every French corps broke through at Krasny. Marshal Ney and his 6,000-strong rearguard arrived on the 18th of November to find the road blocked by 60,000 Russian troops, and no sign of the promised support from Davout's 1st Corps. Ney's men hurled themselves against the Russian lines with desperate courage, but were mown down. Rejecting several invitations to surrender, Ney led the survivors in a daring night crossing of the Dnieper River, then across 45 miles of open country under constant attack from Platov's Cossacks to reach Orsha. By the time Ney rejoined the army, his rearguard was down to just 800 fighting men, leading a column of several thousand stragglers. The army regarded his escape as a miracle, and when Napoleon heard of it, he immediately dubbed Marshal Ney the bravest of the brave.
That is pretty impressive. That is an understatement, okay? It's been very serious for a long time now. This is beginning to be very serious. Napoleon to General Caulaincourt. I have no idea how to pronounce French names, sorry. My one semester of French just went in one side of my head and out the other. I couldn't do it. Just couldn't do it. And a lot of it had to do with the pronunciations. I have lifelong hearing loss. I have enough trouble understanding how to pronounce English words. And French just breaks my brain. I can't hear. I just cannot hear some of the sounds. Anyway, totally off topic. 23rd November near Orsha.
Napoleon had escaped one trap, but now 3 Russian armies were closing in from different directions and outnumbered him nearly 3 to 1. From the east, Kutuzov's main army with 65,000 men. From the north, Wittgenstein with 30,000 steadily driving back Marshal Victor's 9th Corps. And from the south, Admiral Chichagov's Army of Moldavia with 34,000, having detached General Ostensaken with 30,000 to prevent Schwarzenberg's Austrians and Reynier's Saxon Corps marching to Napoleon's aid.
Makes sense. Threaten Warsaw, that'll keep them pinned.
Napoleon was heading for Minsk, a major French supply base with vast stores of the food, clothing, shoes and ammunition that his army so desperately needed. But on the 21st of November, disastrous news arrived. Minsk had fallen to Chichagov. He'd then marched on Borisov, driven out the Polish garrison, and captured its bridge over the Berezina river. By rights, the Berezina ought to have frozen solid by now, so Napoleon could have crossed anywhere. But a sudden thaw had turned the river into a torrent of ice and freezing water. Napoleon was at least joined by the hard-fighting Marshal Oudinot and his 2nd Corps, which hadn't suffered as badly as the main column on its retreat from Polotsk. Oudinot launched an immediate counterattack on Borisov and retook the town.
Okay, so one clarification, just in case it's not obvious. We are in White Russia, Belarus. This is Belarus today. Probably got that from Minsk, but just in case. Today this would be Belarus. And Studienka and Borisov are both in what is now Belarus. Every time I see this city name, I think it's Studienka, which is a female student in Russia. But it's not related to that. It's just a little village. I believe there's a memorial there now to the people who died here during this battle at Borisov.
But couldn't stop the Russians
Berezina.
burning the bridge. With no other bridge for miles in either direction, it seemed Napoleon's exhausted army was finally doomed. But there was one sliver of hope. Polish cavalry had found a ford across the river near the village of Studienka. Napoleon issued a flurry of orders. 2nd Corps was to fake preparations for a river crossing south of Borisov. Victor's 9th Corps, arriving from the north, was to form a rear guard east of Studienka to hold the Russians at bay, while engineers worked as quickly as possible to build pontoon bridges across the river and win Napoleon's army a fighting chance of escape.
Our situation is unparalleled. If Napoleon extricates himself today, he must have the devil in him. Marshal Ney to General Rapp, 28th of November, Berezina River. So even his own people are starting to think he's the Antichrist. Is that what I'm reading here?
On the afternoon of the 25th of November, General Eblé's Dutch engineers began building two 300-foot pontoon bridges across the Berezina River. They worked day and night, sometimes chest-deep in freezing water, and completed both bridges in less than 24 hours. Few of the engineers survived the ordeal. Chichagov had been totally fooled by the diversion south of Borisov, and was moving his troops south to face it, allowing Napoleon's army to begin crossing its rickety bridges virtually unopposed. Oudinot's 2nd Corps led the way to secure a bridgehead, followed the next day by the remnants of the main army. Priority was given to formed troops, still able to fight. For the time being, the army's vast crowd of stragglers remained on the far bank. By the time Chichagov realized his mistake and began moving north, Napoleon had troops in place to defend the crossing. On the east bank, General Partonneux's 12th Division, 4,000 relatively fresh troops from Victor's 9th Corps, formed the rearguard. As Platov's Cossacks approached from the east, the vanguard of Kutuzov's main army, Partonneux tried to rejoin 9th Corps.
They're in trouble, though.
But caught in a swirling blizzard, with visibility down to 50 meters, he marched straight into Wittgenstein's army.
Ow.
His entire division was killed or captured.
Yeah, you can see that one coming a mile away. He was completely surrounded.
The next morning, Chichagov and Wittgenstein launched coordinated attacks on both sides of the river. There was desperate fighting on the west bank, where Marshal Oudinot was, yet again, seriously wounded, but his Swiss infantry held the line, until General Doumerc's cuirassiers, the army's last heavy cavalry, charged and routed the Russians. At great cost, Polish and German troops of Victor's rearguard held off the Russians until dark, then pulled back across the bridges. For 2 nights, officers had been trying to get the vast camp of stragglers to cross the bridges when they weren't being used. But with temperatures reaching -30 centigrade, they'd preferred to stay put, huddled around their fires. At dawn on the 29th, with the army leaving and the Russians approaching, thousands of stragglers surged in panic towards the bridges. Dozens were crushed underfoot. Others fell or were pushed into the water, or tried to swim, which was certain death.
Yeah.
When French engineers burned the bridges at 9 a.m., thousands were cut off and left to the mercy of the advancing Cossacks. Some became prisoners. Others were simply put out of their misery.
What appalling misery! What a multitude have perished in this retreat. Captain Franz Reuter, Lifeguards of the Grand Duke of Hesse.
Since the retreat began 43 days earlier, the Grand Armée had marched nearly 500 miles, under constant attack, starved, exhausted, and for the last 23 days, in lethal sub-zero temperatures, without proper clothing or shelter. In that time, the fighting strength of the Grand Armée had been reduced from around 124,000 men to 20,000.
It's going to get
with
worse.
As many stragglers still following the army. As the retreat continued to Vilna, the weather turned even worse, the temperatures falling to -37 degrees centigrade.
I'm shivering just thinking about it.
The Russian armies at least now held back, leaving the winter, Cossacks and Russian peasants to finish off the invaders. On the 5th of December, Napoleon left the army, travelling incognito across Europe at breakneck speed, and reaching Paris in just 13 days. Naturally, English satirists capitalized on Napoleon seeming to abandon his defeated army.
Oh yeah,
and many soldiers did regard it as an act of betrayal.
Yeah, it's one thing when he did it in Egypt. It's an entirely different thing in this situation, given how disastrous this was. There's no way you're going to spin this into I was needed elsewhere or anything like that, like he could do with Egypt. This is just clearly going to be portrayed as him abandoning his people, and there's not a lot of wiggle room for him to get out of that.
But his generals supported his decision to leave. There'd already been one attempted coup against Napoleon in Paris.
Yes, right.
And there was much work to be done to rebuild the army and reassure France's allies. On the 9th of December, 51 days after the retreat began, around 20,000 ragged survivors of the Grand Armée began crossing the Niemen River back into friendly Polish territory. According to legend, Marshal Ney was the last man across.
Second and third corps are no more than a memory. The latter numbers only 60 men. Marshal Ney to Marshal Berthier, Napoleon's chief of staff.
Napoleon's invasion of Russia had proved to be one of the greatest military disasters in history.
Oh boy, yeah.
He had made fatal miscalculations about geography, logistics, and above all, Russia's political and strategic response to his invasion. These blunders cost his empire around 500,000 men, as well as 250,000 horses and 1,000 cannon. Put another way, of every 12 men who marched into Russia with the Grand Armée, one was killed in action or died of wounds. 2 were taken prisoner, one of whom died in captivity. 7 died from disease or the effects.
I've said this before, I'll say it again. When it comes to war, almost always the #1 killer for most of human history is disease. Absolutely. Or climate, but that still, the climate's killing you primarily through some form of disease. Yeah.
Of climate. Just 2 returned alive. Contrary to myth, many more soldiers had died in the summer advance from heat, typhus and dysentery than were lost in the winter retreat.
Yeah, that
Russian
is true.
Military casualties were estimated.
That's true, but when we take a look at that chart I talked about at the beginning, you can see why people fixate more on the retreat. It looks worse when you visualize it, even just because of the way it's visualized. But if we're talking, well, we'll take a look at the chart. I think that'll show everything we need to say.
At 150,000, and a huge but unknown number of civilian deaths. The Russian campaign was a catastrophe for Napoleon. Not just in lost troops and resources, but in damage to prestige and reputation.
Oh, big time.
That winter, all his enemies sensed weakness and prepared to join forces against him. But the Emperor wasn't going down without a fight. Back in Paris, he admitted to his ministers, "Fortune has dazzled me, gentlemen. I've let it lead me astray. Instead of following my plan, I went to Moscow. I thought I'd make peace there. I stayed too long. I've made a grave mistake, but I'll have the means to repair it." Thank you to all the Patreon supporters who make this series possible.
Yes, thank you, Patreon supporters. Again, great job as always. They're finishing up here. Let's just go ahead and take a look at that chart. Be right back. All right, so this is the Minard chart, and this shows the Napoleonic invasion of Russia. If you look at it closely, you can see it's actually superimposed over a map of Russia. So you have the rivers here, and you can see we're coming through Vilna. You see Polotsk there. You've got, let's see, where are we? Studienska is right down there. Moscow is over here. Smolensk right there. Okay. So you can see it superimposed over a map, so you can see where the armée is at any given time. This is a map that shows not only where the Grand Armée is moving, but its size as it moves. So you can see, like right over here where it's starting, we're upward to 500,000 men. And as we're heading east towards Moscow, you can see we got some groups branching off to other areas. So there's going to be attrition from that, but you can see how the size is getting smaller and smaller as they go. So when you get up here to Moscow, we're at about 120,000 right about this point. So we start with, that's a fifth of what we started with. So when he said this is where they lost the most men, that's actually true when you look at it that way. 500,000 here, roughly 400 to 500,000, and we're down to, what did I say, roughly 100,000, 120,000 at this end. So we've already lost hundreds of thousands of men. Now these 100,000 of survivors are going to turn around and start heading back, and you can see again how they are getting smaller and smaller and smaller. They diverge here, they split, they just getting smaller and smaller. In some cases, this is men rejoining, like the people who went up to Smolensk here, or excuse me, Polotsk here, are coming down and joining here. That's why it gets bigger here and then starts shrinking again. And same thing right here. You got people coming down from up here, reconnecting here, so that gives them a little bit of an growth. But also down here, you'll see the temperatures recorded during the retreat. So we're starting out here at roughly 24, and now we're down to -9, -21, -11, -20, -24, -30 at this point. So you can see it really gives you so much information to look at to help visualize what's happening to Napoleon and his men. So it's really a brilliant chart. It lets you see where they go. It lets you see how big they are at each stage. It lets you see how the temperature is affecting them at each given point. I highly, if you're interested in Napoleon, and especially this retreat from Moscow, or the whole Russian invasion, this chart's something really worth looking at in detail, because it's absolutely brilliant. There's so much you can see at a glance, and you can see here's what they finished with, here's what they started with. Crazy, just absolutely crazy. Now, I don't know if this counts just the fighting man or all the camp followers. I probably knew at one time, but if so, I don't remember. But either way, just really eye-opening in understanding just how catastrophic this really was. You can see it visually here. But it also helps put into perspective what he was talking about. That we think about this as being the really bad part, but in terms of total men lost, this is the bad part. So, again, helps you put that in perspective. So, thank you for joining me. I hope you guys learned something. I know I did, because like I said, I know a lot about the general strokes, the broad picture, plus some of the details of the Russian aspects of this. But in terms of the details of the battles, that's not anything I've ever gotten into before, so seeing that play out was pretty interesting. Anyway, see you next time. We'll be doing 2 more episodes on Napoleon next week. Tomorrow we'll be doing another episode of Caesar, and we'll see where we go from there. So talk to you all later. Bye-bye.